What's the role of society in motivation? That's the question that John Goldthorpe and his colleagues looked at in the 1960s. And whilst this as a motivational theory will have limited use for many people, it's a valuable insight nonetheless, and so we'll look at it in this video. In the 1960s, John Goldthorpe was working with his colleagues David Lockwood, Frank Betchhofer, and Jennifer Platt, and they took a sociological and, let's face it, political approach to motivation in the workplace. It's important to remember that their work is rooted in 1960s British culture, and so the detail will not apply very well these days. However, before you stop this video, the idea at the core of it, I think, is still valid, and one that it really will repay a little bit of reflection upon if you want to understand how people are motivated in your workplace today. Goldthorpe and his colleagues suggested that people bring different attitudes to work, what they called orientations, based on their cultural background, their social environment, and their life history. And I think that this is something that we can agree is always going to be more or less true. It will always be true to some extent, but maybe to a very small extent. It is possible that our background can dominate our motivation at work. They looked at workers with three typical, distinct backgrounds, each of whom they believed brought a specific orientation to the workplace. Now, those three backgrounds were relevant to 1960s Britain. They are, to a degree, still relevant today, and to a degree, you might find that the orientations that they identified are also relevant to understanding motivation of your colleagues in the workplace. Let's take a look at what they found, and then we'll examine it critically. The first type they identified was the affluent type, and the orientation that affluent types bring to work is one of instrumentality. That is to say that they found that people who saw themselves and identified themselves as, to a reasonable degree, well off, comfortable, even rich, they felt confident bringing to work an attitude that I can do things, I can make things happen, I can be the cause of things. And that's what sociologists and psychologists mean by instrumental or instrumentality. The second type that they identified was professional. These are people who have come up from either a privileged background or possibly a low privileged background, but acquired a degree of professional skills. They identify themselves as professionals. They have a pride in their expertise and knowledge base. And the orientation that Goldthorpe and his colleagues identified for them is bureaucratic. They take a process-oriented view of the world. We'll come back to this in a moment, because I think for a lot of the people watching these videos, you will self-identify as professional in one way or another. The third type that they identified were traditional workers, what they might otherwise have called working class, the people who actually do the work. These are not highly affluent, highly skilled, highly knowledgeable workers. And the orientation that they identified for them was what they called solidaristic. That is to say, they believed that they came to work with a sense of solidarity, of a collective identity with one another. Remember, in the 1960s, particularly in Britain, trade unionism was strong and powerful. They believed that workers came to work with that attitude, with an orientation towards collaborating together to improve their working conditions. So, how does all this play out today? I'll leave it to you to assess whether the late 1960s British types are relevant to you and whether the orientations that Goldthorpe and his colleagues identified match your own experience. However, I do want to take a look at the professional and traditional types that they identified, because there have been some specific changes that I've seen in my lifetime, which started early on in the 1960s, which I don't remember. First, let's look at the traditional workers. Remember, they were working before the political revolution which took place in Northern Europe and North America in the 1980s, led by people like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. A real cutting back of trade unionism and a real growth in the idea of personal capitalism. I think the attitudes of most workers today have changed significantly, but I also experience that, with few exceptions possibly, most workers actually come to work without a social-based orientation. For me, this doesn't ring true, but for you it might, because your culture, your experience, your workplace may be very different to the places where I've worked. But I have worked all of my career as a professional, self-identifying that way, and also working with many professionals in many professions: architects, accountants, lawyers, planners, consultants, the whole range of professionals. And whilst I can identify the idea of a technocratic orientation towards getting things right, doing things properly, and taking pride in the knowledge and the knowledge work we do, what I don't see is a heavy orientation towards the way people think of bureaucracy, of filling in forms and dotting I's and crossing T's. That doesn't seem to me to be the prevailing professional orientation these days. However, as I say, that may be different for you. Well, what I would encourage you to do is, if you haven't seen our video on Daniel Pink's Motivation 3.0 and his focus on knowledge work and heuristic work, and therefore the need for intrinsic motivation, I recommend you do so. So, Goldthorpe and his colleagues had a good idea, the idea that people bring attitudes to work, and that dictates their orientation towards what motivates them. The extent to which the types they identified and the orientations they match to those types will be relevant to you in your culture today is doubtful, but I do think it is a good exercise. Take some time to reflect on the people you know at work and the extent to which they bring their backgrounds into work, and those backgrounds influence the way that you can motivate them. Please give us a thumbs up if you like this video. There's loads more great management courses content to come, so please subscribe to our channel and hit the bell so you don't miss any of it. I'll look forward to seeing you in the next video, and in the meantime, keep learning.